Time to continue our story. The story of Gulliver's Travels. Part 2. Chapter 6. Upon what I said in relation to our courts of justice, His Majesty desired to be satisfied in several points, and this I was the better able to do, having been formerly almost ruined by a long suit in Chancery, which was decreed for me with costs. He asked what time was usually spent in determining between right and wrong, and what degree of expense, whether advocates and orators had liberty to plead in causes manifestly known to be unjust, vexatious, or oppressive, whether party in religion or politics were observed to be of any weight in the scale of justice, whether those pleading orators were persons educated in the general knowledge of equity, or only in provincial, national, and other local customs, whether they or their judges had any part of penning those laws which they assumed the liberty of interpreting and glossing upon at their pleasure, whether they had ever at different times pleaded for and against the same cause, and cited precedents to prove contrary opinions, whether they were a rich or a poor corporation, whether they received any pecuniary, let's see, it's pronounced
Pecuniary.
That's too loud. Okay. Pecuniary. Whether they received any pecuniary reward for pleading or delivering their opinions, and particularly whether they were ever admitted as members in the lower Senate. He fell next upon the management of our treasury, and said he thought my memory had failed me, because I computed our taxes at about 5 or 6 millions a year, and when I came to mention the issues, he found they sometimes amounted to more than double, for the notes he had taken were very particular in this point, because he hoped, as he told me, that the knowledge of our conduct might be useful to him, and he could not be deceived in his calculations. But if what I told him were true, he was still at a loss how a kingdom could run out of its state. How a kingdom could run out of its estate, like a private person. He asked me who were our creditors and where we found money to pay them. He wondered to hear me talk of such chargeable and expensive wars. That certainly we must be quarrelsome people, or live among very bad neighbors, and that our generals must needs be richer than our kings, and that our generals must needs be richer than our kings. He asked what business we had out of our own islands, unless upon the score of trade or treaty, or to defend the coasts with our fleet. Above all, he was amazed to hear me talk of a mercenary standing army in the midst of peace, and among a free people, He said, if we were governed by our own consent in the persons of our representatives, he could not imagine of whom we were afraid or against whom we were to fight, and would hear my opinion. Whether a private man's house might not be better defended by himself, his children, and family than by a half a dozen rascals picked up at a venture in the streets for small wages, who might get 100 times more by cutting their throats. He laughed at my odd kind of arithmetic, as he was pleased to call it, in reckoning the numbers of our people by a computation drawn from the several sects among us, in religion and politics. He said, he knew no reason why those who entertain opinions prejudicial to the public should be obliged to change or should not be obliged to conceal them, and as it was tyranny in any government to require the first, so it was weakness not to enforce the second. For a man may be allowed to keep poisons in his closet, but not to vend them about for cordials. He observed that among the diversions of our nobility and gentry, I had mentioned gaming. He desired to know at what age this entertainment was usually taken up, and when it was laid down, how much of their time it employed, whether it ever went so high as to affect their fortunes, whether mean, vicious people by their dexterity, by their dexterity in that art, might not arrive at great riches, and sometimes keep our very nobles in dependence, as well as habituate. I think it's habituate. I'm not sure. Let's see. Habituate.
Habituate.
Habituate. Okay. Yeah, it's habituate. As well as habituate them to vile companions. As well as habituate them to vile companions, wholly take them from the improvement of their minds and force them, by the losses they received, to learn and practice that infamous dexterity upon others. He was perfectly astonished with the historical. He was perfectly astonished with the historical account I gave him of our affairs during the last century, protesting it was only a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, the very worst effects that avarice, faction, hypocrisy, prejudice. Okay, I don't know what this is pronounced. What? Really? Pronounce it. Okay, whatever. Perfidiousness, 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 perfidiousness. I bet it's perfidiousness. Okay, let's see. perfidiousness, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, envy, lust, malice, and ambition could produce. Let's read this one again. It was only a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, the very worst effects that avarice, faction, hypocrisy, perfidiousness, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, envy, lust, malice, and ambition could produce. His Majesty, in another audience, was at the pains to recapitulate the sum of all I had spoken, compared the question he made with the answers I had given, then taking me into his hands and stroking me gently, delivered himself in these words which I shall never forget, nor the manner he spoke them in. My little friend Grilldrake, you have made a most admirable panegyric upon your country. I have no idea how this is pronounced. Let's see.
Panegyric.
Panegyric upon your country. You have clearly proved that ignorance, idleness, and vice are the proper ingredients for qualifying a legislator, that laws are best explained, interpreted, and applied by those whose interests and abilities lie in perverting, confounding, and eluding them. I observe among you some lines of an institution which in its original might have been tolerable, but these half erased, and the rest wholly blurred and blotted by corruptions. It does not appear from all you have said how any one perfection is required toward the procurement of any one station among you, much less that men are ennobled on account of their virtue, that priestesses are advanced for their piety, or learning, soldiers for their conduct of valor, judges for their integrity, senators for the love of their country, or counselors for their wisdom. As for yourself, continued the king, who have spent the greatest part of your life in traveling, I am well disposed to hope you may hitherto have escaped many vices of your country. But by what I have gathered from your own relation, and the answers I have with much pains wrung and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Very true. That is very true. Humans are awful. Let's say this passage again because I like it. But by what I have gathered from your own relation and the answers I have with much pains wrung and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Human trash. Okay. Chapter 7. The author's love of his country, he makes a proposal of much advantage to the king, which is rejected. The king's great ignorance in politics, the learning of that country very imperfect and confined, the laws and military affairs, and parties in the state. Nothing but an extreme love of truth could have hindered me from concealing this part of my story. It was in vain to discover my resentments, which were always turned into ridicule. It was in vain to discover my resentments, which were always turned into ridicule. and I was forced to rest with patience, while my noble and beloved country was so injuriously treated. I am as heartily sorry as any of my readers can possibly be that such an occasion was given, but this prince happened to be so curious and inquisitive upon every particular that it could not consist, either with gratitude or good manners, to refuse giving him what satisfaction I was able. Yet, thus much I may be allowed to say in my own vindication, that I artfully eluded many of his questions and gave to every point a more favorable turn by many degrees than the strictness of truth would allow. Okay, let's see this one again. And gave to every point a more favorable turn by many degrees than the strictness of truth would allow. For I have always borne that laudable partiality to my own country, which Decius Hellis. Okay, I'm not gonna even try to read that. Hellis, is that an even English word? What the hell? Oh, it's a Roman philosopher, historian. Of course, it's a name.
Dionysius of Halicarnassus, historian.
Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Okay. Which Dionysius Halicarnassus with so much justice recommends to an historian. I would hide the frailties and deformities of my political mother, and place her virtues and beauties in the most advantageous light. This was my sincere endeavor in those many discourses I had with that monarch, although it unfortunately failed of success. But great allowances should be given to a king who lives wholly secluded from the rest of the world, and must therefore be altogether unacquainted with the manners and customs that most prevail in other nations, the want of which knowledge will ever produce many prejudices and a certain narrowness of thinking, from which we and the politer countries of Europe are wholly exempted. And it would be hard indeed if so remote a prince's notions of virtue and vice were to be offered as a standard for all mankind. To confirm what I have now said, and further to show the miserable effects of a confined education, I shall here insert a passage which will hardly obtain belief, in hopes to ingratiate. Maybe how it's pronounced. So let's see. Ingratiate. I hope it's ingratiate.
Ingratiate.
Okay. Ingratiate. It's an interesting word. In hopes to ingratiate myself further into His Majesty's favor, I told him of an invention discovered between 300 and 400 years ago, to make a certain powder, into a heap of which the smallest spark of fire falling would kindle the whole in a moment, although it were as big as a mountain, and make it all fly up in the air together with a noise and agitation greater than thunder, that a proper quantity of this powder rammed into a hollow tube of brass or iron, according to its bigness, would drive a ball of iron or lead with such violence and speed as nothing was able to sustain its force, that the largest balls thus discharged would not only destroy whole ranks of an army at once, but batter the strongest walls to the ground, sink down ships with 1,000 men in each to the bottom of the sea, and when linked together by a chain would cut through masts and rigging divide hundreds of bodies in the middle, and lay all waste before them. That we often put this powder into large hollow balls of iron and discharged them by an engine into some city we were besieging, which would rip up the pavements, tear the houses to pieces, burst and throw splinters on every side, dashing out the brains of all who come near. That I knew the ingredients very well, which were cheap and common. I understand the manner of compounding them, and could direct his workmen how to make those tubes of size proportionable to all other things in his Majesty's kingdom, and the largest need not be above 100 feet long, 20 or 30 of which tubes, charged with the proper quantity of powder and balls, would batter down the walls of the strongest town in his dominions in a few hours, or destroy the whole metropolis if ever it should pretend to dispute his absolute commands. This I humbly offered to his Majesty as a small tribute of acknowledgment in turn for so many marks that I had received of his royal favor and protection. The king was struck with horror at the description I had given of those terrible engines, and the proposal I had made. He was amazed how so impotent and grovelling an insect as I, these were his expressions, could entertain such inhuman ideas, and in so familiar a manner as to appear wholly unmoved at all the scenes of blood and desolation which I had painted as the common effects of those destructive machines, whereof, he said, some evil genius, enemy to mankind, must have been the first contriver. As for himself, he protested that although few things delighted him so much as new discoveries in art or nature, yet he would rather lose half his kingdom than be privy to such a secret, which he commanded me, as I valued any life, never to mention any more. A strange effect of narrow principles and views, that a prince possessed of every quality which procures veneration, love and esteem, of strong parts, great wisdom and profound learning, endued with admirable talents and almost adored by his subjects, should, from a nice unnecessary scruple, whereof in Europe we can have no conception, let slip an opportunity put into his hands that would have made him absolute master of the lives, the liberties, and the fortunes of his people. Neither do I say this with the least intention to detract from the many virtues of that excellent king, whose character I am sensible will, on this account, be very much lessened in the opinion of an English reader. But I take this defect among them to have risen from their ignorance, by not having hitherto reduced politics into a science, as the more acute wits of Europe have done. For I remember very well, in a discourse one day with the king, when I happened to say, there were several thousand books among us written upon the art of government, gave him, directly contrary to my intention, a very mean opinion of our understandings. He professed both to abominate and despise all mystery, refinement. He professed both to abominate and despise all mystery, refinement, and intrigue, either in a prince or a minister. He could not tell what I meant. He could not tell what I meant by secrets of state, where an enemy or some rival nation were not in the case. He confined the knowledge of governing within very narrow bounds, to common sense and reason, to justice and lenity, to the speedy determination of civil and criminal causes, with some other obvious topics which are not worth considering. And he gave it for his opinion that whoever could make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. Basically, they are saying that a farmer is better than a politician. That is very true. And he gave it for his opinion that whoever could make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. The learning of this people is very defective, consisting only in morality, history, poetry, and mathematics, wherein they must be allowed to excel. But the last of these is wholly applied to what may be useful in life, to the improvement of agriculture, and all mechanical arts, so that among us it would be little esteemed, and so to ideas, entities, abstractions, and transcendentals. Okay, that's an interesting word. Let's see how it's pronounced.
Transcendentals.
Transcendentals. And as to ideas, entities, abstractions, and transcendentals, I could never drive transcendentals. Transcendentals. Makes sense? Transcendentals. I could never drive the least conception into their heads. No law in that country must exceed in words the number of letters in their alphabet, which consists only of 2 and 22. But indeed, few of them extend even to that length. They are expressed in the most plain and simple terms, wherein those people are not miracular enough to discover above one interpretation, and to write a comment upon any law is a capital crime. Let's see, how is this pronounced?
Mercurial. Mercurial.
Mercurial. Mercurial. Mercurial.
Mercurial.
Mercurial. Not mercurial enough to discover above one interpretation, and to write a comment upon any law is a capital crime. As to the decision of civil causes or proceedings against criminals, their precedents are so few that they have little reason to boast of any extraordinary skill in either. They have had the art of printing, as well as the Chinese, time out of mind, but their libraries are not very large, for that of the king, which is reckoned the largest, does not amount to above 1,000 volumes, placed in a gallery of 1,200 feet long, whence I had liberty to borrow what books I pleased. The Queen's joiner had contrived in one of Glumdalclitch's rooms a kind of wooden machine 25 feet high, formed like a standing ladder. The steps were each 50 feet long. It was indeed a movable pair of stairs, the lowest, and placed at 10 feet distance from the wall of the chamber. The book I had a mind to read was put up leaning against the wall. I first mounted to the upper step of the ladder, and turning my face towards the book, began at the top of the page, and so walking to the right and left about 8 or 10 paces, according to the length of all the lines. till I had gotten a little below the level of my eyes, and then descending gradually till I came to the bottom, after which I mounted again and began the other page in the same manner, and so turned over the leaf, which I could easily do with both my hands. With both my hands, for it was as thick and stiff as pasteboard, and in the largest folios, not above 18 or 20 feet long. Okay. That will be it for today, and I will see you in the next one.